Hey there! So today we're going to be looking at the events that led up to the Civil War. While there were many events that took place before this time, there were just a few that became pivotal moments that would eventually become the start of the Civil War. So without further ado, let's get into it. Missouri Compromise. Okay, so the first event to take place was the Missouri Compromise. This compromise was passed to admit Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state. Within this compromise, it prohibited slavery in the Louisiana Territory north of a special latitude line. On February 16, 1820, the Senate combined both the Missouri and Maine bills together to form the Missouri Compromise. On March 1, 1820, the House made a version of the Missouri Compromise that was separate from the Senate's version, and the next day, on March 2nd, both the House and Senate agreed to the Senate's version. With votes being 134 to 24, the House concluded that slavery would be prohibited above the latitude line in the Louisiana Territory. 4 days later, President James Monroe signed the Missouri Compromise. Henry Clay was actually the leading congressman to broker the compromise. The compromise only lasted for 30 years. The Compromise of 1850. Another major event to take place during this time period before the Civil War was the Compromise of 1850. This compromise created 5 new laws that were passed in September. Henry Clay again brokered this compromise to try and resolve issues between the North and the South. He first introduced the resolutions on January 29, 1850. The next month, on February 5th and 6th, he had to defend his case about creating the compromise. His ideas about resolving these issues were met with a lot of opposition. On March 4th, a senator by the name of John Calhoun made a speech opposed to the compromise. Calhoun was not able to deliver his speech, so another senator named James Murray Mason read it. While some opposition was made public, there were others who were in favor of the compromise. Senator Daniel Webster made a speech about his agreement with the compromise. This speech is famously known as the 7th of March speech because it was delivered on March 7th. With the support of the compromise, it was passed in 1850, which prevented further expansion of slavery states, but it did help to strengthen the Fugitive Slave Act, which was a law that pressured Northerners to return runaway slaves back to the South. This would bring heavy tension later on. Dred Scott versus Sanford. The case of Dred Scott versus Sanford was a monumental factor in the escalation of the Civil War. This case consisted of a man by the name of Dred Scott suing for his freedom in court. It later was taken to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decided that slaves were not considered citizens in a court of law, therefore not able to sue. Abraham Lincoln actually spoke on the Dred Scott case. During his speech in December of 1856, he famously concluded that a house divided against itself cannot stand. He was in opposition of the Dred Scott decision and pushed for the country to either become one or nothing at all. Another famous opinion made was by Frederick Douglass. All in all, Douglass was obviously opposed to the decision and in his speech asked all people of America to fight for what was constitutional. Later, the Dred Scott decision was overturned by the 13th and 14th Amendments. The Battle of Fort Sumter. In the final event that would occur leading up to the Civil War, the Battle of Fort Sumter took place in Fort Sumter, South Carolina. This would later be considered the beginning of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln had decided to send his troops with fresh supplies. However, the Confederate Army turned the supplies away in open battle that lasted 34 hours. This was the very beginning of the Civil War.